Good morning, CRRA.
Welcome to round two. Everybody is networking and having a great time and talking it up, but we need to get you in your seats. Please come on in.
How you doing, Laura? How's your day?
So far, so good.
I feel good.
Yeah.
I feel like Amy Poehler. Do you feel like Tina Fey?
Basically, I think we're legitimately that funny.
I think so.
I think
this isn't quite as long as the Academy Awards show. That's the difference.
Right on. So welcome to day two. We're all here, stuck inside. If you hear anything loud and exciting outside, that's the Art and Soul Festival, but the news is you have to stay here. No going outside and having fun. Stay here and learn all that you can and enjoy another amazing plenary. Wasn't yesterday amazing?
Yesterday was amazing. Who was here for yesterday's opening plenary? How about Vienne? So, we brought in Vienne. We were actually gunning for big game. We wanted to bring in Van Jones, another Oakland legend, and he's a little bit out of our price range. And, Vienne is Van's #1, and all of these organizations that Van Jones started and created out of Oakland. And so, we were very gratified. We brought in Ven to keep it real and to bring something new into our first day. And if you can't keep it real in Oakland, where can you keep it real? We're very excited about today. We've got David Allaway, who will be introduced in turn to keep it real in the wonkish part of our plenary program. So we're very much looking forward to that.
Absolutely. And now we're going to be inviting up our executive director, Tracy Bills, our interim executive director.
For those of you that were here last year, we had a new executive director, and that relationship was short-lived. We were so fortunate to bring in on a contract basis a legend in our industry, Tracy Bills. Welcome her, please, to the stage now.
Thanks, Peter. So sweet. I'm super excited to help CRRA continue its excellent reputation for fantastic programming and networking at our conference, and to assist with building this organization according to our vision, mission, and principles. It's always an honor to be here. It's like a whole family reunion, so it's super awesome. If you want to hear a little bit more about what CRRA has been up to this year, I would welcome you to come to our members meeting at 1 o'clock upstairs in the junior ballroom, so please join us. And then I wanted to thank all of our sponsors, which we're going to recognize shortly, for your support of CRRA. Without you, we would not be able to have an excellent conference that's also financially successful, so thank you. And then I also want to thank our members, presenters, exhibitors, and volunteers for all your efforts in making this conference such a success. And of course, I really want to thank our staff, Despina and Lauren. They are the rock of our organization. Yeah. And quite frankly, they're just amazing. So if you get a chance, thank them as well. So I was reflecting on yesterday, and I was so impressed with Mayor Libby Schaaf. She was incredible. It was refreshing to see her enthusiasm and honesty about her experiences, and I think you all probably recognize that as well. She was pretty honest about some stuff. And then our keynote speaker, Vienne Tong, she was amazing, wasn't she? I loved listening to her. She has to be one of the most compassionate and driven people I think I've ever met. And case in point, sometimes with our keynote presenters, we actually give them money to be able to be here. She actually donated all of that money back to the new Young Professional Scholarship Program that CRRA is putting out this fall. Yeah. So that's pretty incredible that she was able to do all of that on our behalf. So I think it speaks volumes of her character and her compassion. So between the great sessions, TC lunches, tours, exhibitor reception yesterday, I hope you all had a great time so far, and I'm really looking forward to today and the rest of the conference. So thanks so much for coming to Oakland and enjoying your weekend with all your CRRA friends. So thank you for being here, and then as far as the next part of our program, we're going to go ahead and move on to thanking our sponsors. So this is how it's going to work. We're going to name the group that you're in for the sponsors, and you have one representative come up over here. We're going to take a group picture quickly, And then you'll exit over here and get your certificate. So it's going to be pretty quick. And when I announce your group, don't wait for me to announce your company's name. Just come on right up, okay? So first, we've got the President's Circle, and these are our major sponsors. Huge thank you to these four: Cal Recycle, City of Oakland, San Francisco Department of the Environment, and Stop Waste. All right, so forgive us for a second while we take a quick picture.
There's Tom.
All right, and now our gold sponsors. Come on up now. Marin Sanitary Service, R3 Consulting Group, Recology, Republic Services, Rethink Waste, Management, Rethink Waste, City of San Diego, and City of Vallejo. And next, our bronze sponsors: Alameda County Industries, City of Chula Vista, EDCO, Gigantic Idea, Mojave Desert and Mountain Recycling, Monterey Regional Waste Management District, City of Napa, Napa Recycling, City of Palo Alto, Recycle Smart, Salinas Valley Solid Waste Authority, City of Santa Cruz, Specialty Solid Waste and Recycling, Zero Waste Marin, and SCS Oh my God, I totally did the wrong one. So I actually just skipped. Oh my goodness, I made the biggest faux pas ever. We were supposed to be on silver sponsors, and I just announced the bronze sponsors. So all the bronze sponsors, okay, bronze sponsors.
I guess we're just going to take a bronze and silver together.
What does that mean?
Oh, bless Peter. He just said it's a commingled joke. Okay, so, and as far as our silver sponsors, if you have not already come up, please come up. Athens Services, Cascadia Consulting Group, California Refuse and Recycling Group, Economics, City of Fremont, Food Service Packaging Institute, Green Waste, HF&H Consultants, City of Livermore, Mattress Recycling Council, SCS Engineers, Stanford Recycling, Stanford Recycling, PSI Waste Management, and Zanker Recycling. And I think we got everybody. Yeah, that was silver, but I think we got everybody already, so. Oh my goodness, so sorry. Thanks, you guys. And that's probably the last time they're going to let me announce awards. Friends sponsors: California Association of Local Conservation Corps, California Association of Recycling Market Development Zones, HDR, Mount Diablo Resource Recovery, NatureWorks, and City of Sunnyvale. And lastly, we have a couple of reciprocal benefit partnership agreements, one with California Product Stewardship Council, one with Californians Against Waste, and one with Keep California Beautiful. So please come up. All right, with that, please welcome Nick Lapis. He's the CRRA Policy Committee Chair, which is a great person to tie in with our keynote speaker. Nick?
Thank you, Tracy. Let's give Tracy a round of applause. Let's also give a round of applause to Tina and Amy for putting on a great conference for us. So I have the pleasure to introduce David Allaway as our plenary speaker. Some of you might remember we had David as a speaker down in the desert, what was that, 8, 9 years ago at this point, and he blew everyone away, so we're excited to have him back. David is a senior policy analyst with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. He is with the Oregon DEQ Material Management Program, and since 1989, he has helped hundreds of businesses and communities, including many in California, reduce their environmental impacts of materials and waste consumption. I think what I've found really inspiring about David is his ability to change the paradigm on climate change. He really changed the thinking, the conventional wisdom from climate change is caused by tailpipes and smokestacks to really looking at what communities consume and the impacts that has on their greenhouse gas inventories. And I'm sure your eyes probably glazed over at that. But when you think about it, when you flip your light switch at home, you have a greenhouse gas impact even if the power plant is outside of your community. And David really took that same approach and applied it to the materials you consume. When you buy something at the store and you consume it, there's a greenhouse gas impact that might happen from mining bauxite or from refining a material or transporting it. And when you start looking at all of those emissions and you start looking at all those impacts, you realize that reducing waste is one of the easiest, most cost-effective ways to reduce climate change. And if it wasn't for David's work in Oregon, I'm not sure we would have a lot of the climate policies we've had in California. So with that, I'll invite David up, and you guys will have a great presentation.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I wish we could have California's climate policy in Oregon. That would be very exciting. So good morning, and thank you, Nick and CRRA, Tina and Amy, for the invitation to speak. This is a great conference. I'm really enjoying it, and one of the reasons why is it reflects the positive motivation and the creativity of so many people in this room and your movement. So thank you for innovating and continuing to push the envelope with so many great things you're doing down here. I was last here in 2009 when we were all just starting to explore the connection between recycling and climate. And some things have changed since then. There's a lot of new faces in this room. California has made meaningful strides in climate leadership. Marine debris has taken on greater urgency. China has finally cracked down on low-quality bales, and as a result, collection programs, especially here in the West, are facing one of our greatest challenges ever. So now's a good time to pause and take stock of where we are, where we want to be, and whether we're on a trajectory that will get us there. What are we trying to accomplish? Do we have the right tools in our toolbox? Does our measurement system point us in the right direction? These are the topics I want to explore with you today. I want to explore some hidden connections between wastes and materials, and between waste, materials, and the environment. I've been told, warned actually, that there are some people in the room who are skeptical or even critical of Oregon's policy approach. And I want to say that's entirely fair. Like California, our state laws are the product of political compromise. The politics are different. Regardless, I would hope that people of good intention can learn from each other. Whatever you think of Oregon's approach, I want to be clear that if your motivation is to protect the environment, if you work to serve and help others, then I respect your devotion, your intention, and your motivation. And at the same time, we need to be able to respectfully explore different approaches and question our assumptions. Questioning assumptions is what the zero waste movement was built on. So zero waste is promoted as a means to protect the environment, and as such, it's important that we have some grounding in environmental science. You were warned this was going to be wonky, and it will. We're going to do a little science here. But first, a little bit about science. My sister lives in Del Norte County, and she has a bumper sticker on her car that says, "Minds are like parachutes. They only function when open." A great, great statement. Equally great is Carl Sagan, who once said that, well, it pays to keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. So science is a field of study that tries to achieve a middle ground between these two extremes. It requires that we keep an open mind and that we be open to new information, but we also hew to objective observations of measurable physical phenomena. Most of us are not scientists, but all of us operate within mental frameworks, ways of understanding the world. For many in this room, that's probably zero waste. It may be sustainable materials management or circular economy. Whatever the framework is that you use, they all make implied assumptions about how the world operates. And we need to remain open to objective, science-based observations that may challenge those assumptions. If these observations show a disconnect between the actual world and the way the world, between the way we assume the world operates and the way it really does, then we have a couple of options. The first option is we can just disregard the evidence, which is the easy thing to do, but to quote your governor, Jerry Brown, being on the wrong side of science is rarely a winning proposition. Alternatively, we can examine the evidence in more detail, perhaps seek some additional data. And if these objective observations confirm that our mental framework isn't entirely accurate, then the honest approach is to adjust it. And that can be really difficult, especially if you work in an echo chamber. But let's be clear here. Groupthink is not our friend. Groupthink is what enabled the unsinkable Titanic to set sail on its maiden voyage. Groupthink is what enabled and set up the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. The environment is both more resilient and more complex than the Titanic or the Space Shuttle, but it is subject to the very same physical laws and human hubris that led to their destruction. If we really care to protect the environment, and I know that you do, then we need to pay attention to science. We mustn't allow groupthink to blind ourselves to the unintended consequences of our actions, however well-intentioned they may be. So I have some tough love to share with you today. It's going to cause some discomfort. I'm sorry, but to protect the environment, I feel obligated to speak it. What I see in the zero waste movement is a wealth of good intention and also some confusion. The movement was originally about zero wastes, plural, reducing all types of wastes and emissions to the environment, including emissions to air and water. And over the years, it's morphed into something much simpler, just keeping municipal solid waste out of landfills. The motivation is sincere, and it has led to some really great solutions. California has connected cap and trade with funding for organics recovery infrastructure solutions. That's totally cool. Californians Against Waste advocacy regarding degradable plastics has been brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. It's wonderful. CalRecycle has some very ambitious efforts. Businesses and local governments across the state have some really wonderful waste recovery programs, and there's a little bit of experimentation moving up the hierarchy. And at the same time, some of your programs are not realizing their full potential. I know you all want to do the best you can when it comes to protecting the environment, and so I hope you can listen with an open mind, and there's no shame in changing your mind after considering some new information. So on my flight down here, I struck up a conversation with a gentleman seated next to me. He's actually down here in the Bay Area interviewing for a job at a city. Some of you may end up working with him, so to protect his identity, I'm going to call him Ishmael. Ishmael was hired last year by a city in Oregon to manage their municipal fleet, you know, the cars that people drive around in to do city business. And he was told that his job was to provide vehicles at the lowest overall cost to the city. So he sat down and he thought about, what does that mean, lowest overall cost? Well, he realized there's the cost to purchase and lease the cars, and there's also the cost to fuel them and maintenance and repairs, and then there's resale value, because at a certain point you don't want the cars anymore and you sell them back. So he didn't know anything about resale value. He started going to conferences and workshops and reading trade magazines. He learned all he could about resale value, and he learned something that I didn't know, and that is that cars that are painted pink depreciate at a lower rate than cars that are painted other colors. I don't know why that is, but that's what it is. So if you want to optimize resale value, you're going to buy cars that are painted pink. So he shared some pictures of what he started buying. This was for the Human Resource Department. They got this one. The city manager got that one there. And the sewer inspectors in the Public Works Department got this nice limo to drive around in. And suddenly and abruptly, without any warning whatsoever, he was called into his boss's office and fired for malfeasance. Now, I assume you would all agree that Ishmael made a serious mistake in optimizing one part of the life cycle costs of these cars while ignoring all of the rest. And of course, this story is total BS. But I've shared it with you because I see something similar happening in the recycling community today. Solid waste is, of course, just one piece of the life cycle of materials, and for most materials in this country, it isn't particularly impactful. The production and transport of materials contributes 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. Disposal contributes about 2%. For most other environmental impacts, production is where nearly all of the environmental burdens occur. Disposal barely registers. There's one very important exception to this, and that's marine debris, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Recycling and composting were originally promulgated as means to an end, a means to reduce environmental impacts. Today, I see them promoted as the end goal itself. Recycling program managers busily work to maximize recycling and composting without considering the rest of the story. And somehow, zero waste has been reduced to just zero solid waste. There's an assumption that if we divert waste from landfill, it will eliminate all of the upstream impacts as well, the pollution of air and water from resource extraction and production. But it turns out that that isn't true. And if the zero waste movement is only about solid waste, then it's never going to realize its true potential. So today I want to look at a couple of big ideas. First of all, first principles, why do we recycle? The benefits and also the limitations of recycling. The importance of goals and metrics, the difference between recycling and recyclability, and some proposals for moving us forward. So let's start with first principles. Why do we recycle? I cannot answer that question for you, but in Oregon, our policy framework is clear. We recycle to reduce the impacts of landfills, to conserve resources, and reduce pollution. So good news, recycling and composting are good for the environment. They reduce pollution, they conserve resources. How do we know this? Intuition, but also a type of quantitative analysis that is called life cycle assessment, or LCA. The environmental benefits of recycling have been studied extensively using LCA. A few years ago, CRRA reviewed many published LCAs on this topic, and a significant majority of these studies found that for a wide variety of materials, recycling is typically preferable to landfilling or incineration. EPA's WARM tool shows similar results, but limited to energy and greenhouse gases. WARM shows that in Oregon, for example, recycling and composting in 2016 reduced greenhouse gas emissions by about 2.9 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. That's close to 5% of our statewide emissions from all sources. California probably has pretty comparable results. So recycling can definitely help to reduce our carbon footprint. And that's a great thing. And how do we know it? Because of life cycle assessment. I've heard in the last couple of days that there is some skepticism about life cycle assessment, but it is LCA that demonstrates the environmental benefits of recycling and how recycling protects the environment. And if you like that message, please think carefully before shooting the messenger. In this country, most of the environmental benefits of recycling are upstream, not downstream. The benefits when recycled wastes displace virgin feedstock in manufacturing often dwarf the reductions in landfill emissions and impacts. Landfills just are not, they still pollute, but they are not nearly as polluting as they were when us old-timers entered this field decades and decades ago. But our narrative hasn't really evolved. The benefits occur upstream, but we keep framing the issue as one of landfill avoidance. The impacts are also not so much about collection or transportation. A few years back, I did a rough analysis for the city of Portland's curbside program and found that yes, collecting recyclables in a dedicated truck results in greenhouse gas emissions. But when those collected recyclables get to market and displace virgin production, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is almost 40 times greater. It's a great investment. Recycling and composting are beneficial and even necessary. And if done right, they can be a great investment that conserves resources and reduces pollution. We need good recycling, but recycling comes with a couple of caveats. And I want to share 4 of them with you this morning. The first is that collecting stuff is not the same as recycling it. There has to be a viable market. Those markets have detailed and sometimes narrow specifications for what they can and cannot accept. It doesn't matter how many people call City Hall and ask for yogurt lids or plastic bags to be added to your collection program. If your MRF, and there are some that can do this, but if your MRF isn't capable of sorting them and sending them to a dedicated market, you're not actually recycling. Now, what happens when we lose sight of this fact? Down the Columbia River from Portland is the Norpac paper mill. It produces 750,000 tons of paper annually. It used to buy waste paper from across the West, including extensive purchases from California. Then commingling and single stream became commonplace. This graph shows pulper rejects as a percentage of production. Norpac spent millions of dollars on capital upgrades and additional maintenance trying to make recycling work because making paper from recycled waste saved them energy and energy costs. But by 2010, for every 100 tons of paper produced at this mill, the mill had more than 20 tons of garbage, which recyclers sent to it, coming out of its pulper. The contamination was too much. Norpac switched back to using virgin feedstock. Recycling failed because of contamination that the recycling community largely turned a blind eye to because we could always send our bales to China. The second caveat is that while recycling and composting are necessary conditions for a sustainable future, they are not always the ideal solution. Just one example of this, and this stems from a life cycle assessment my office commissioned a few years ago looking at different methods of delivering drinking water. Here on this graph are 5 different environmental and human health impacts for water delivered in a recyclable single-use PET bottle recycled at 2 different rates, 37% in blue, 62% in red. And you can see that a higher recycling rate for these bottles reduces environmental and human health impacts. That's a good thing. But it doesn't reduce them by that much. And there are some other solutions. Since we published our study, many in industry have made their bottles thinner. They've lightweighted them. And the environmental impacts of that relative to the standard bottles is shown in green. Consumers can also do something. We can drink out of a tap in a reusable bottle. And if you drink out of a reusable bottle, that's shown here in aqua. And this is the worst case reusable bottle scenario we could imagine. It's a reusable bottle that is washed every single day in the model of dishwasher, which by the greatest margin ever failed to qualify for EPA's Energy Star program. Okay, in the last 30 years. If, in contrast, you drink from a reusable bottle and wash it once a week in an Energy Star dishwasher, you get results shown there in orange. And if you can't see them, it's because the impacts are almost 0 when compared to drinking out of a recyclable PET bottle and recycling it. So recycling is beneficial, but it isn't always the best solution. Similar results are found for other materials, including food waste. A ton of prevention is worth a whole lot more than a ton of composting or AD. And we need to design our recovery programs so that they don't disable prevention efforts. Last year, researchers at Ohio State University demonstrated that they could reduce the wasting of food by more than 70% in a dining hall through strong prevention messaging. However, once composting was offered, nearly all of the waste prevention gains were lost. Waste went up, people wasted just as much as before, and environmental impacts went up. So this year, we're starting a research project in Oregon to identify how we can all message composting while at the same time advancing prevention as opposed to disabling it. Now, this relates to our third caveat. that recycling is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Many of you have seen this here, EPA's system-based inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. It shows that 42% of our nation's emissions are associated with materials. How would this change if we would achieve the nirvana of near total recycling and composting? A 95% MSW recycling and composting rate would reduce these emissions by 6%, which is not at all trivial, but it's also not sufficient, as it leaves most of these emissions untouched. We need additional tools, such as prevention and cleaner production. Greenhouse gases, of course, are not the only impact of materials, but they're an important considerations. I want to consider the oceans for a minute. Some of you may recall back in 2014, when tens of thousands of auklet carcasses washed up on beaches from California to British Columbia. Anyone remember that? You should. It was pretty horrific. What killed these seabirds? Plastic straws? Non-compostable food serviceware? No. Researchers at the University of Washington concluded that the culprit here was global warming. The giant worm blob off the California coast that upended the marine food chain and caused a mass starvation. In this country, materials are responsible for 42% of our carbon emissions, and the US is the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And in addition to warming the oceans, CO2 also acidifies the oceans. Seawater is 30% more acidic today than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution worldwide, and it's going up. Now, Jenna Jambeck has led some of the work to quantify the global marine debris problem. Her team estimated that in 2010, about 80,000 tons of plastic directly entered oceans from US shores. That is 80,000 tons too much, but it's less than 1% of the global total. If we sincerely want to protect the oceans, we need to be supporting marine debris solutions in Asia and Africa, where most of the marine debris originates. Are we? The same year of Jambeck's estimate, the US exported more than 5 times as much plastic for recycling to countries such as China that are major sources of marine debris. And you all know that some of that plastic, especially low value and highly contaminated materials, didn't get recycled. And if they weren't recycled, where did they go? Recycling in this country is not a meaningful solution to the global problem of marine debris. We need to be honest about that, and we need some additional tools. And as we consider possible solutions, we need to avoid perverse consequences, such as switching to materials that increase global warming or ocean eutrophication, that are not as visually obvious, but are even greater threats to marine life. We also need to avoid following Starbucks' recent example and eliminating straws with a redesigned lid that uses more plastic, a polypropylene which they claim is recyclable, but which few collection programs or MRFs are actually prepared to handle. Thanks. So the fourth caveat is that where recycling is necessary, not all recycling is the same. Recycling can be done well, and it can also be done poorly. Sending bales of mixed crap to China may keep it out of your landfills. It may help you to achieve your landfill diversion goal, but it's not protecting the environment. Since some recycling is good, is twice the recycling twice as good? Is a 90% recycling rate twice as good as a 45% recycling rate? Well, let's explore that using a couple of analogies. Water is essential to life. We all need to drink water. You can't live long without it, but drinking too much water will kill you. The same is true for consuming protein. Our bodies need proteins to build and repair tissues, to make enzymes and hormones, but eating too much protein can wipe out your kidneys. Alcohol can be good for many people in moderation. The same is true for exercise, sex. Sorry. The list goes on and on. But there's hardly anything for which extremism is better than moderation. And as we reach towards 100% recovery, there are diminishing returns and increasing costs, both financial and environmental. And this matters because we live in a world of finite resources. Spending money in one area forecloses opportunities to spend it somewhere else. So you owe it to the public to consider both the benefits and the costs of your programs and to consider other ways of achieving your higher order goals of conserving resources and reducing pollution. And that brings us to the topic of goals and metrics. In any endeavor, goals can be powerful because they get otherwise disconnected people and organizations all pulling in the same direction. So what does a landfill avoidance goal do? What signal does it send? It tells us that landfills are a problem, and specifically that heavy landfills are a problem. But the heaviness of our landfills is not a root driver of environmental impacts. In theory, a landfill avoidance goal could empower actions across all the upper tiers of the hierarchy, but in practice, this rarely happens. In fact, the disposal avoidance goal seems to flatten the hierarchy. Landfill bad, everything else equally good. Let's just recycle more. Landfill avoidance goals tell the public that putting stuff in the garbage is naughty. You should feel bad when you do that. So I've got this redesigned polypropylene Starbucks lid. I guess I should put it in my recycling cart. No wonder there's so much contamination. Landfill avoidance goals create dirty bales of paper. Landfill avoidance goals enable the production of compost that is full of non-compostable plastic. Ship crap off to China, keeps it out of our landfill, we're closer to our local goal, woohoo! But is that really what you want to accomplish? No. There are different ways to set goals. Alameda County has a good stuff metric that's a better measure of how effective programs are at capturing recoverable materials. But without tracking material to its end market, it still doesn't really tell us how much is actually being recycled. Oregon does not have the same disposal avoidance goal that California does. Instead, we have two parallel goals. The first is a waste recovery goal, the percentage of waste generated that is recovered. Every year we conduct a major statewide survey that quantifies the tons of materials recycled and composted, and where possible, we follow the materials through to their end market to find out if they really were recycled. It allows us to calculate a waste recovery rate for the state in almost every county. But this recovery data serves a second purpose. We add recovery to disposal tonnages to estimate overall waste generation. And that led Oregon's legislature to adopt a second goal to reduce overall waste generation, not disposal, but generation. Use less stuff. The recovery goal empowers composting and recycling programs, and the parallel generation goal empowers prevention and reuse, because that's the only way you can achieve that goal. We don't count prevention and reuse the way California tried in the early years of AB 939, but we do keep an eye on overall generation, and we aim to reduce it. And that's a key reason why Oregon takes the hierarchy seriously and invests effort at the top of it. So just a couple of examples of that. Preventing the wasting of food, we've refocused our state grants program to support projects on the ground. We're also doing extensive work on baseline measurement, business pilot projects, outreach through business groups, and messaging research, all about prevention, wasting less edible food in the first place. We're piloting the use of financial assistance to grow the workforce in reuse and repair businesses and nonprofits across the state. The city of Portland has banned the mechanical demolition of older homes, and with DEQ and industry is growing the local deconstruction workforce and infrastructure while trying to figure out how to do this in a way that protects people from the impacts of lead. The city of Eugene provides water bottle filling stations at events. Clackamas County is working to replace milk cartons in school cafeterias with reusable cups and milk dispensers. We're also invested in building both the supply and demand for smaller houses, including accessory dwelling units. Living small uses fewer materials in construction, remodeling, and maintenance, and it enables lower consumptive and less wasteful lifestyles. The state, local governments, and partners have changed codes and zoning. We've waived system development fees, pioneered new appraisal standards, changed green building certification and incentive programs, and done extensive outreach. Over a 10-year period, these smaller accessory dwelling units have gone from about 3% of permitted single-family building permits in Portland to almost 50%. These types of investments flow from Oregon's new policy framework, described in this document here. The 2050 vision was adopted in 2012. It provides a vision for sustainable materials management and a variety of types of actions necessary to realize that vision. Those actions include sustainable production and consumption, prevention, reuse, recycling, and safely managing discards. All these actions exist to serve a higher order goal, which is to realize the vision here: conserving resources, protecting the environment, and living well. The 2050 vision says Ishmael, stop talking only about end of life and start looking at the whole life cycle of materials. Oregon's measurement approach is far from perfect. Like California, our current system is denominated in tons. It treats a ton of plastic or aluminum the same as a ton of yard waste or food, both from a generation and a recovery perspective. But our vision also calls for new and better measurements. Our goal is to conserve resources and reduce pollution, so that's what we should be measuring against. So we're building a new accounting framework that's based on environmental impacts as opposed to just tons. In the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about going upstream. For Oregon, this means more prevention and reuse, and it means engaging with businesses and industry on making design and production changes to minimize the overall environmental impacts of products. In contrast, some advocates for zero waste, or rather zero solid waste, are calling for all products to be reusable, recyclable, compostable, or banned. Because without that, you can't achieve zero solid waste. My office thinks this isn't necessarily the best approach, and let me explain why. Recycling and recyclability are fundamentally connected but not the same. Recycling is a verb that describes what we do with the material once it's already been produced and we no longer want it. And the LCA literature is very clear this is a preferable method for managing those discarded materials. Recyclability is an adjective that describes an attribute, which is the ability to recycle something. It says nothing about whether or not the material is inherently higher or lower impact. Elemental mercury is very recyclable, but no sane person wants it in commerce. The same distinction is true of composting and compostability. One can love composting while questioning compostability. For many years, I promoted these attributes. In my 20s, I nearly quit my job to avoid working for a client that made non-recyclable packaging. But later, I started discovering bits of evidence that recyclable or compostable items didn't always have the lower environmental impact. And why is that? Because different materials have different upstream environmental impacts. That's where most of the impacts occur. They're not the same materials. And recycling does not fully obviate or reduce all of those upstream impacts. So these were just one-off examples, and we didn't know if they were atypical or not. So last year, we commissioned a meta-analysis of existing published literature, specifically life cycle assessments over the last 17 years, that would allow us to answer this question. How well and when do popular material attributes correlate with reduced environmental impacts? We haven't published this yet. We will soon. My colleague Minal shared a sneak preview of some results earlier this morning. I'm just going to share a couple of highlights now. These are comparisons from studies that evaluate different levels of recycled content in the same packaging material. For example, glass bottles with 0 versus 50% recycled content. We found 259 different comparisons of this type involving packaging in the literature, and the vast majority of them, shown in green, demonstrate environmental benefit. On this graph, green indicates that the attribute in question, in this case recycled content, results in lower environmental impacts. So that's good news. This is an instance where this attribute can be used with strong confidence. This pattern, however, doesn't hold when comparing different materials against each other. For example, when comparing aluminum versus glass, or PET versus aseptics, recycled content is not a reliable predictor of environmental benefits. Comparing the same material, more recycled content is a good thing. Comparing dissimilar but functionally equivalent materials, not so useful. How about recyclable packaging versus non-recyclable packaging? Here we found 344 comparisons in the literature, and the results are all over the map. Sometimes recyclable packaging has a lower impact. The number of comparisons where this is found is shown in green, and sometimes recyclable packaging has higher impacts, even after giving full credit for the benefits of recycling that material, and those comparisons are shown in red. You cannot safely assume that recyclable packaging always is the better environmental choice. This is from 344 different comparisons. That's a lot of data. So I don't have time to explain the compostability results, but they're even worse. This is for food service ware. The point I want to make is that recycling and composting are beneficial. I want to be totally clear about that. But if our mental framework requires that we recycle and compost everything, and then everything must be recyclable or compostable, then we can no longer safely assume that we're actually protecting the environment. Pushing recycling and composting to this extreme will, at least in some cases, actually undermine the very goals of conserving resources and protecting the environment that the zero waste community aspires to achieve. Now, why does this matter? About 12 years ago, I was involved in the early years of the Sustainable Packaging Coalition. The SPC members were engaged in efforts to understand and reduce environmental impacts across their full life cycle. SPC created a software tool called Compass that allowed its members to conduct rapid screening assessments of different packaging options. I wandered away from the SPC for about a decade, and I came back 2 years ago to attend their annual conference, and I didn't recognize the organization. Something had radically changed. Compass was gone, and I witnessed several senior managers from Fortune 500 companies, one of them headquartered in California, take to the podium and proclaim, and I paraphrase, you know, we used to evaluate packaging for its environmental impacts, but our marketing department really didn't appreciate the nuance of that. They're responding to our customers, and our customers just want to recycle everything. So that's what we're going to give them. We're going to design all of our packaging to be recyclable. Environmental impacts be damned. So how did this happen? Why is industry abandoning holistic, science-based evaluation of materials in favor of simply making everything recyclable and compostable? If you ask these businesses, they answer consistently, we're responding to public pressure. Some of you have helped to engineer that public pressure. You are driving change. Congratulations, I guess. But it's not going to lead to the environmental benefits that you want. It is a strategy, it's a very well-intentioned strategy, but it's a strategy that will win the battle against landfills and lose the war to protect our larger environment. It will accomplish zero solid waste while increasing other wastes. So how did we arrive at this really unhappy place? Because I am just like Mr. Wet Blanket up here. I'm sorry. This is why CRRA isn't paying me anything. So I don't have anything I can donate to you. I'm sorry. Except for my airplane ticket, and I kind of suspect you want me to leave at this point. So I don't know. So it's my hypothesis that in the last 10 to 20 years, elements of the modern recycling advocacy movement inadvertently and unintentionally went off the rails. And there's a number of factors that conspired to achieve this result, and here are some of them. By focusing on the wrong goal, in particular landfill avoidance, recycling programs became disconnected from higher order environmental benefits, and program managers and the public began to lose sight of why we recycle in the first place. Our implicit assumption that all materials are the same ton for ton further disconnected us from our higher order goals of conserving resources and protecting the environment. We focused far too much on collection while giving too little attention to markets. Markets is where the environmental benefits of recycling are at, and markets is where recycling lives or dies. We've placed undue burden on individual consumer responsibility in trying to get all, 45 million Californians or however many you have here engaged while letting corporations off the hook. Some in industry have aided and abetted this tragic detour. There are some who are captive to the fetish of economic growth, and they would much rather advance an agenda of recycling than engage in a much more difficult but essential discussion about the impossibility of perpetually growing the economy on a planet with finite resources and very real environmental limits. At the same time, most recycling programs have spent the last 3 decades giving only lip service to the upper tiers of the hierarchy where we could begin to engage in that discussion. Examine your budgets, look at your FTEs, and show me more than a handful of real, meaningful investments in prevention and reuse. Some members of our community have grown sloppy with science, disregarding inconvenience evidence and replacing it with dogma. There's been a bunch of groupthink, and then scientists like me who knew better but failed to interject earlier because we're essentially conflict averse. And then, many recycling advocates have inadvertently elevated solid waste reduction above all other environmental considerations, assuming that just keeping stuff out of landfills will somehow magically eliminate multiple types of environmental impacts over the entire life cycle of materials. This last flaw, focusing on the small element, in this case solid waste, while ignoring the bigger picture, is what my new friend Ishmael did at his former job managing the city fleet, and that didn't turn out well for anybody, except the sewer inspectors. They really liked their pink limo. The good news is, I think we can get back on the rails, and so here's a modest proposal. I'd like to see state and local governments and businesses adopt better goals and metrics. Goals such as actual recovery or capture rates, waste generation rates, or better yet, goals denominated in the very environmental impacts we want to reduce, such as toxics or energy use or marine debris. Recycling programs need to align collection with markets, focus much more on quality, and treat recyclables first and foremost as commodities, not wastes. Cities need to stop treating recycling collection as an extension of the garbage program and start managing collection for what it always should have been, a key element in the supply chain of feedstocks for industry. Tell me, collection programs and MRFs are essentially aggregators from a whole bunch of small suppliers in order to provide a feedstock to industry. In what other industry does a material aggregator pay little or no attention to the quality of the materials they're collecting or the quality of the materials they're selling? None, because any real business that did that wouldn't survive very long. When you think of recycling collection as a means to provide industry with feedstock, you design your programs differently. And one way of strengthening that relationship between generators, collectors, and users of recycled materials is to make the ultimate end users, the producers, share in the responsibility for collection through extended producer responsibility. Even as we improve recycling, we also need to expand our toolbox. There is so much crazy untapped potential in waste prevention and reuse, and there are still other approaches, such as cleaner production and sustainable consumption. Product and packaging design needs to consider design for the environment broadly, including the marine environment, but also the larger environment, not just design for recycling and compostability. I've got a company in Oregon who has operations in California. They're required in one coastal community to use compostable packaging, even though in order to protect the marine environment, even though the compostable packaging doesn't degrade in the marine environment. It makes no sense. And she called me up and she said, "What are they smoking in California?" It's like, I don't know. I don't understand really what's going on with that. Our community needs to invest internal capacity in understanding the environmental impacts of materials. The impacts are too complex, they are too important, and they are too important to keep guessing about. And most importantly, we need to maintain recycling and composting in our minds and our policies as means to an end. Not something to maximize for the sake of maximizing, but something to optimize in order to achieve a higher order goal to conserve resources and reduce pollution. Ishmael, the guy next to me on the airplane, is down here in Oakland, actually. He's looking for a job. I saw him at the farmer's market yesterday. You might give him a second chance and hire him into your community here. I know you could teach him some really wonderful things. In the conversations I've had in the last 2 days, it is so clear you are, as a community, sincere, well-motivated, creative, talented people. There is great innovation in California. Like you, Ishmael doesn't want to be inadvertently harming the environment. So please don't let him repeat his mistake. Don't let him optimize one part of the life cycle while ignoring the bigger picture. John Muir got it right when he said, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." Solid waste is connected to materials and through those profound impacts on our planet. Caring for the environment requires that we break free from this narrow box of solid waste. It requires that we pay attention to the much larger impacts of the materials that eventually become waste. The changes I'm suggesting will not be easy. Some will be disruptive. Some will run contrary to existing programs and popular wisdom. But popular wisdom, while always popular, is not always wise. Focusing on one piece of the life cycle while ignoring the rest is not a formula for long-term success. We can't keep running our programs the way Ishmael ran his. Change is hard, but change we Change we must. So I'm going to end with another quote, this one from the late uncle of Peter Parker, he of Spider-Man fame. His uncle Ben said, "With great power comes great responsibility." California, you have that great power. Together, you have that great power. So please, please use it responsibly. Thank you.
I'll take issue with one comment you made, and that's when you claimed that you were conflict averse. I think we all know that's not exactly true.
Okay.
I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, if that's correct. John is somewhere. John, can you stand up?
No, Nick, you're the other one. Get out there.
Just me? Oh,
You and me.
All right. So Peter and I have microphones. We're going to be roaming. If anybody has questions, put your hands up, and let's give David hell,
Don't worry.
or not.
One over here, David.
Hi, David. Miriam Gordon with Upstream. I really appreciate your admonishing us and also, encouraging us to focus on prevention. It was the third, prevention and reuse, it was the third proposal in your last slide. And I also agree with you that we've been too focused on just getting stuff out of landfill and diversion. And I understand that that your focus on prevention in Oregon has been on pretty much everything but packaging, from what I can see, or just at least packaging's not in there. And in previous conferences, I've heard you say that because marine debris, packaging coming up on Oregon's shores is not a big deal there. We have many, many more, we have a much greater population, much greater urban density.
Yep.
And we're also sort of a leader in modeling for consumption behavior for the rest of the country and the rest of the globe. I think the US, we've modeled the throwaway society in the US and exported it to the rest of the world. So do you think that prevention is something that we ought to be focusing on in California?
Yes, I do think prevention is something you ought to be focusing on. For packaging, we have done some work around prevention of packaging. We just completed a pilot project in several schools outside of Portland where we paid to install drinking water dispensers, and we had some students do some promotion to other students in the schools. It was a really effective program, so effective that at a couple of the schools, vending machine sales of bottled water fell so much that the owner of the vending machines has pulled the plug and taken them out. So, that project was my idea. We're looking at doing this pilot project around, not a pilot project. We're looking at the results of the Clackamas County pilot projects around milk dispensers in schools and looking to do something similar. So we are doing some work around packaging. I think one of the reasons why, and this attributes study was obviously around packaging, we have kind of a love-hate relationship with packaging, frankly. Packaging is where all the public focus seems to be. It's packaging, packaging, packaging. And when we evaluate the environmental impacts of materials broadly, we see that for most types of environmental impacts, packaging contributes 5 to 15%. So something has been lost in our rush to solve the packaging problem, and that something has been a focus on products. We're not going to save the environment with 5 to 10% reductions in the impacts of materials. We have to focus on products. And as we focus on products, we need to really look at packaging and products as a system, because environmentally that's how they operate. So should you be focusing on prevention of packaging? Yes. Should you also be focusing on prevention of products, like food? Absolutely. And as you focus on prevention, I would urge you to be careful to avoid unintended consequences, to not assume that since one type of material has a highly visible environmental impact, that other, such as marine debris, that competing materials that don't have as much of that impact are inherently better. Some are better and some are not. And so as you work to avoid what you see as a bad option, please be careful that you switch to a good option as opposed to one that just shifts burdens somewhere else.
You don't need to be Miriam Gordon and an expert to ask questions. When I first heard David in 2009, I had so many questions. We're going to try to get to everyone, but if you're new here and you don't have a question, you're not a total brainiac on it, please stand up, ask your question. More questions, please.
David, Steve Lautzi, the Association of RMDZs, thank you so much, and heard your closing of California has power. We might have to wield our best power. We might have to change. This is a little fuzzy, but what do you see as the elements in Oregon that took you to where you guys are in analyzing the problem versus the situation in California? Miriam mentioned some of the differences that we need to watch out for.
Sure. So I'm not an expert in California. I cut my teeth down here. I spent most of the first 10 years of my career doing a lot of consulting work in California, northern, central, southern. That was a long time ago. As I look in California, and I mentioned at the beginning, I really think there's a lot of great things that are happening here. So I don't want to be like total wet blanket. But it seems to me that one important distinction is that the state, and in particular CalRecycle, but the state as a whole and also local programs seem very wedded to this disposal avoidance goal and a framework which is about keeping stuff out of landfills. And this gets communicated in a way, the example I gave about the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, it gets communicated to local governments and policymakers and the public and businesses in a way that elevates the agenda of keeping waste out of landfills to a very sort of high priority. Now, I don't want stuff in landfills, but I also don't want to keep stuff out of landfills in a way that inadvertently harms the environment. Shipping stuff off to China so that they can't recycle it and they can burn it or dump it. I don't want, in the session you were in, there was some reference to diversion mania, right? And the unintended consequences of focusing so much on just keeping stuff out of landfill, keep it all out of the landfill. Something got lost along the way, and that something was an understanding of this bigger picture and the higher order goals. There's an assumption. It probably sounds kind of bad, like I'm implying that you don't want to conserve resources or reduce pollution. That's not true. I know California does. But maximizing solid waste avoidance is not the same as optimizing the solid waste system. Maximizing solid waste avoidance will tell you to recycle and compost everything. And yeah, you could do prevention and reuse, but frankly, they're harder and you don't get as many tons. So if you really want to go after tons, just do recycle and compost. And I think the prioritization and the programming across California really reflects the force of that landfill diversion mandate. And in contrast, if you were oriented around achieving your higher order goals of conserving resources and reducing pollution, you would still have a lot of the same programs, but some of them would be designed differently, and you might be investing more in some other areas where you're currently disinvested. Thank you.
Hi, David. Oh, this end.
Hi.
It's Mary Alice from Disney, and you made a mention that California had made an attempt to quantify source reduction in the early 90s. I think you're probably referring to the Business Users Guide or the Diversion Study Guide by Eugene Sung and that group.
Partially, I'm really referring to the process that went on in 1990, 91, 92, where local governments and folks like Eugene and his graduate students fanned out across the state and started counting grass clippings left on golf courses, and reuse through thrift shop sales and garage sales, and the city of Long Beach with its proposal to achieve AB 939 compliance by counting the annual reuse of the Queen Mary, and all these crazy things that happened, and a whole bunch of work and a whole bunch of effort and busyness that went into counting a bunch of things, but never actually doing anything with it. That's what I'm referring to.
Okay, so I actually still use it. Gave it to a colleague who was trying to calculate pallet reductions, reusable pallets, and there's a good module about that. I would agree that I'm sure it needs updating. It was from the early 90s. But is that something maybe Oregon's going to be coming out with as a tool to quantify it? I totally agree with you that we need great, tools that we all agree are useful to count source reduction.
Yeah, that's probably not going to be a priority area of ours. It's not that it's a bad idea, it's that we, like you, have limited resources.
I wonder if anyone else is doing something along those. Yeah.
And the resources, and we've done a number of projects where we have gone out with businesses and quantified the source reduction at the business scale. It's not difficult to do at the business scale. We did a project a few years ago that was focused on packaging, where we worked with some businesses and found ways to help them use less packaging material. It reduced the weight of their packaging used by 492 tons a year and saved $997,000 annually. So at the business level, quantifying source reduction isn't that hard. At the community scale, it's a whole lot more difficult. And one of the problems, to come back to Miriam, with just quantifying source reduction in terms of tons, is it reinforces this crazy belief that all tons are the same. They're not. I mean, one of the ways in which one of the businesses in this pilot project reduced their use of packaging was they switched from a heavy material to a lightweight material. What is the environmental benefit of that? Oh, we don't know, it's just tons out of the landfill. I mean, that's not what we're trying to accomplish. We're not trying to keep tons out of the landfill. We're trying to conserve resources and reduce pollution. So if that's what we're trying to accomplish, that's what we should be measuring. And so to the extent we have a budget and we have one FTE and a little bit of another to focus on measurement, we're focusing on measuring environmental outcomes as opposed to chasing tons. Thanks.
We have time for just a few more. Hang on, Nick. Hang on, Nick. We've got a lot of conversation here. We have very little time. So the degree to which you can keep your question really short is the degree to which you offer an opportunity to your colleagues to have a voice, if you get my meaning.
Me too.
Hi, Richard Gertman, a retired consultant. What are your thoughts as to the impacts of Amazon shipping boxes? What can we do about that?
That was a question.
Thank you. I haven't given a whole lot of thought to Amazon shipping boxes. We're focused more on products and less on packaging. So it's not a topic I've given a lot of bandwidth to. I do know from our own packaging LCA that they could, and there's a lot of potential there for them to reduce their packaging. For example, at one point when they were shipping books, they had this cardboard that folded around the book. It was like a custom size thing, much less cardboard, much less material, much more efficient in transportation. And then the last time I ordered a book from Amazon, it came in this box. I don't understand why. Obviously, there's more they could do. And then they could also be doing more to support the burden that they are placing on local government recovery infrastructure and disposal infrastructure for the non-disposable fraction of this material. They could be helping to pay for that.
Hi there. My name is Katie. I'm from San Diego. I'm right here. I'm from the San Diego County Regional Airport Authority. Understand that reduction is best. If you can't do that, maybe use reusables. But there's times where we're still going to consume. You mentioned different products have different environmental impacts. Do you have a resource for us that ranks the environmental impact of different materials so that we can make the best choice?
Not really. We should. Where we've gotten so far in this research is to evaluate what everyone is currently doing, which is to use these popular attributes, and then to discover that those popular attributes aren't always pointing in the right direction. So the next logical step, and I don't know if we're going to do this or we're going to encourage someone else to do it, the next logical step would be to comb through this data and start doing more evaluation to say, well, if you're not supposed to use the attributes, then what should you use? It's a very unsatisfying answer. I'm very sorry. I don't have a better answer. But we're still, frankly, we are still reeling internally. We didn't fully expect the consequences we got on those graphs. And we're still kind of like, oh my God, now what do we do? So we're feeling some of the same pain you are about not knowing quite what to do, except that the evidence on reusables we've seen is that reusables are almost always preferable. Yeah.
David, last question. So many more questions, really big issues. Sorry we can't get to everyone. Last question.
Hi, David. I'm Susan Collins, Container Recycling Institute. And my question is, we want to give you a magic wand. What really, really big thing or number one thing do you think we should do in California, given how powerful we are with 40 million people? Is it to change the metrics so that we change the way we're all thinking and we all start moving our programs in a different direction? Or is it something like what you said about the houses? I mean, you've got all of this in your head. If we were going to do one thing or two things, what should we do?
I'm so sorry I didn't think about that beforehand. I never imagined anyone would offer me a magic wand in California. Maybe Disney could help out with that, I don't know. Put on little ears or something. Wow, so, oh my gosh, I mean, there's so much that can be done. I think at the end of the day, where I see misalignment, where I see good intentions and creativity and positive energy resulting in some unintended consequences, most of the time it's a consequence of the framing of the goal. And so I think I would come back to that and encourage you. I mean, I don't know your I don't know your politics. I don't know if this is possible. Oregon can count recovery. California should be able to count recovery. If you can count recovery and you can count disposal, then you have the pieces you need to count generation, to enable movement, real movement and investment at the top of the hierarchy. And from there, you have much of what you need to start evaluating the environmental impacts of what you're doing and aligning the outcomes you want to achieve with the programs you're implementing to try to achieve those outcomes. So I think I would start with goals.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, sure.
All right. Wasn't that wonderful? Another excellent plenary. Let's give him one more round of applause. That does it for this plenary session. I just wanted to make one quick announcement. As you see in your program, tomorrow's plenary will be Daniel Silverstein, or Zero Waste Daniel. And Daniel has offered to make here at the conference a unique textile. This is actually made out of all California-based scrap textiles. Even though he's based in New York, he actually came out early and sourced these scraps and put this together during the conference. He's at booth 36 in the exhibit hall, so go say hello to him. There is a raffle. For a $10 donation, you can get a ticket for the raffle. So we encourage you, higher, there it is. It's beautiful, isn't it? So we encourage you to take advantage of that and go say hi to all the exhibitors at the exhibit hall lunch. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much.